Good morning. Good morning. My name is Steve Straessle. I am the head of school at Catholic High School, and sometimes wannabe columnist for the Democrat Gazette. None of you read it, that's fine. It's mostly read by blood relatives, and I don't see any blood relatives in the crowd today. But thank you so much for coming out. You are going to love what we have today with Monica Potts and Rachel Martin. Their books are extraordinary. But first, I want to say thank you to the Central Arkansas Library System for providing this event for us. I mean, there is not much, thank you. Not many things better to do when it's 110 degrees in a late September Saturday. So sitting inside an air-conditioned auditorium listening to two great authors is just perfect. Also want to thank the sponsors for this event. And the sponsors have already invested in the Central Arkansas Library System. They're the architects who are doing the renovation for the main system. And so that's Polk Stanley Wilcox, WER, and Stocksman Architects. So a round of applause for them for sponsoring us. And now I get the great honor of introducing our authors. First is Rachel Martin. She is a PhD historian from Nashville, Tennessee. She's been featured in the Oxford American, the Bitter Southerner, among other things, and has written a book called Hot Hot Chicken, which we're going to talk about in a little while as well. So please welcome Rachel Martin. And before I introduce the next one, how many of you are from Clinton, Arkansas? Okay, I figured. Did Clinton win last night football? Do we know? We don't care. You're here to see Monica, not football. Talking about football. Well, homegrown Arkansas writer Monica Potts is a gem. Without question, she has been featured, and her writings have been featured in Vogue and The Atlantic. She wrote for the American Prospect. Now she is a journalist for 538, which is an excellent resource for campaigns and politics, especially in the coming years. So I'm very pleased to introduce Arkansas's own Monica Potts. Okay, well, let's get started. First, Rachel, I want to ask you the very first question. You wrote in your bio, as I was reading, that you are especially interested in the politics of memory. What do you mean by that?
A lot of times when we talk about memory, I think we think of it as being like a video recorder, where you press record, it starts recording everything that happens, you press stop, and you have this perfect record of what has happened before. And the reality is so much messier than that. Memory is a wonderful way of understanding how we make sense of ourselves, of our community, of our spot in the world. It's absolutely useless when it comes to things like numbers or even dates. Or my favorite example of this is there was an English queen who was beheaded at one point, and every single eyewitness said that it took one blow of the axe to take her head off. They exhumed her body, it took 3. But there's something very important about the fact that everyone remembers a single blow. And so for me, the politics of memory is how we remember and how we choose to forget, and specifically in relationship to my work, how that then reinforces inequality in America today.
Well, great. So you kind of cover that in your book. You know, your book, A Most Tolerant Little Town, I'm going to have you talk about it in just a second, but the politics of memory are just throughout this book. You say there were 500 people at this rally, 1,000 people, 2,000, and I'm thinking, is this like an auction? I mean, is she, trying to get to the right answer? But I get it, what you're saying about memory. Tell us a little bit about your book.
So, I hate to say that there would be rivals in school desegregation, but we'll say this is a different school desegregation account than what y'all probably know very well. Clinton, Tennessee happened in 1956, so it was a year earlier than Central High. It was a massive story at the time that the school desegregated. There were huge riots in the town. Our governor also had to send in the National Guard, but he sent in the National Guard to enforce the court order instead of to prevent it. The choice that probably cost him the presidency and probably also ended up influencing your governor when it came time. Eventually the school was bombed and destroyed and rebuilt by an international fundraising campaign headed up by Billy Graham, the evangelist. Yeah, right? But nobody remembers it. And so it felt like a wonderful opportunity to talk about the missed chances in American history. Clinton High School is unique, not only because it is so early, but also because unlike any of the other contested desegregations of that time, the school never closed and it never resegregated. In the midst of all of that violence, these 14, 15, 16-year-old kids continue to get up every morning and they continue to go to school. What they do is they prove that desegregation could happen in the American South and it could happen immediately. And when we talk about the politics of memory, I don't think it's a mistake that we have decided to forget that possibility.
Very good. Good answer. Monica. So I work in an all-boys school, and I told them I was going to moderate a book called Forgotten Girls. And they were like, I think they may be punking you, Mr. Straessle. It's maybe like one of those things to, get you to see the Barbie movie or something like that. But this was a book about much more than just, your relationship with your friend Darcy. This was about a ton more. Can you tell us about your book a little bit, please?
Yeah, so about a decade ago, I started to see studies about the declining life expectancy of the least educated white Americans, and it was particularly hitting white women hard. They were losing 3 to 5 years of their life compared to the generation before, depending on what study you looked at. And I really thought this was a phenomenon that covered rural America and covered the place that I knew best, my hometown, that I had left when I was 18. And I thought it was a story about some of the women I had left behind there. And as a coincidence, I was coming home to research the book, and I just, my childhood best friend reached out to me and reconnected with me at that time. And we talked about it, and we talked about the trends I was going to write about and explore and investigate in my book. And she said, well, maybe you should just write about me, because her life had really embodied these trends. And that's when it became a memoir, and story about my childhood best friend and I, and how our lives described the forces happening all across America.
That's great. Well, you do such a good job describing that relationship as the backdrop for the bigger scene that you just mentioned. Let me read something to you. You wrote this. So I wanted to read much more than just what I'm going to read because it was beautiful. It says, the Ozarks bear some resemblance to their cultural cousin, Southern Appalachia, and to any other spot where poor white Americans live on soil too rocky to farm. These lands get lumped into what demographers call Southern Highland culture, a nice term for hillbilly. From the start, the Ozark spirit was passive, nagged by a vague feeling that life was beyond control. Sit down and wait for the black sadness to settle in. The folk songs are about hard times, dead children, and men and women murdered for love. Peaks and hollows like Petty Jean Mountain and Goodnight Hollow are named after little kids lost in the woods. Though people worship God, they are obsessed with the devil and warn of the spooky caves he dwells in. that wasn't in Forgotten Girls. It was another piece that you wrote. Well, tell us about the Ozarks. Tell us what Clinton, Arkansas means to you.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it means home. It's a place where my family has really long, deep roots. My mom's family's been there for about 100 years. But I did always feel growing up that there was the sense that life was happening to other people and that people couldn't quite grasp the driver's wheel, that they had to just let things happen to them and learn how to deal with it and kind of recover from things instead of steering towards their own future. And I think that was something I always struggled with as a child, is trying to figure out how to steer my own future. And so that's sort of what it meant for me as a place where I had to sort of fight that kind of tendency to just let things happen and lie.
Were you reluctant to write this story at all? We, many of us grew up in rural communities. I grew up in the metropolis of Little Rock, but many of us grew up in rural communities and understand, what you're talking about. So did you have any reluctance to write it, or was it just full bore? Let's tell the story.
I felt like I had to write it. I felt like I owed it to Darcy to tell her story. I think she was at a point in her life when she wanted to kind of take control of her narrative and feel like it had meant something, and I felt that I could help her do that. And through her story, other women who had lived similar lives. So that was really motivating.
How have the people of Clinton received this book?
I don't know. I haven't sought out their opinion.
Well, they're here to see you, so but you moved back to Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're living and still part of the community and so forth. See your old teachers. Do you see folks that you meet, that you mentioned in this book?
I think it's a bit like religion and politics, where people are happy to not talk about anything that might rock your boat, and I'm happy to let them do that and so much. I will say I have heard from a number of people from Clinton or from towns like it who really felt like it was the truth about small towns and wanted to say that they thought that I had written their story or the story of someone they knew. And they were really happy to have it out there.
That is exactly what I've heard as well about your book from others, is that it could have been any other small town. And Rachel and I were talking about her small town experience, and very similar to what you wrote. So, yeah, excellent. Okay, Rachel, would you mind reading us a bit from your book, please?
Absolutely. Quick logistical. Am I doing it here or are we on the podium?
Wherever you're more comfortable.
Less juggling at the podium. I'm very glad that you started things off with a question about memory, because that's where we're going to start in the book today. And to borrow a phrase from Julie Andrews, we're going to start at the very beginning. It's a good place to start. The process of forgetting an event as important as the desegregation of Clinton High School sounds passive, but it requires an active correction of the record. When I started my work in Clinton back in 2005, my first oral history interview was with Margaret Anderson, a white woman who had been the high school's business and typing teacher. She had served as the unofficial guidance counselor for the 12 Black students. Though she had not believed in desegregation when the 1956 school year began, she did believe in obeying the law. The Black student struggle to remain in Clinton High changed her into a true integrationist. She wrote about desegregation in a series of articles for the New York Times, which she later expanded into a memoir, The Children of the South. In her narrative, she centered the Black students and castigated many white leaders. Maybe that was why, when I was introduced to her by a local white official just old enough to have seen events for himself, he admonished her. Now remember this, Anderson, you lied in your book. he said. You tell Rachel what we agreed had occurred. After he left, Margaret made me a mug of instant coffee and we sat down in her parlor to chat. She was nervous. When I don't want you to record it, could I just raise my hand or something, give you a signal, she asked me? That way I feel free, you know what I mean? I didn't realize it that morning in Margaret Anderson's kitchen, but I would spend the next 18 years of my life immersed in the stories that the people of Clinton had to share, whether their neighbors wanted them to or not. And as each person I spoke with would show me, William Faulkner was right. History wasn't dead. It was barely even in the past. And I don't just mean that stories told by grandparents and great-grandparents lived on in their descendants' minds. This history was so recent that many of the participants themselves were still alive. When locals looked at the pictures of white rioters around the school, they knew the faces captured on film. A sensation I'm sure many of you are familiar with as well. These are the people they shopped with at the local food city, or worshipped with at First Baptist Church, or traded presents with every Christmas. The people in the pictures had birthed and raised them. The best way to settle conflict over desegregation was to let it lie, many white folks said. Or, as one founder of the Tennessee White Youth told me, honey, there was a lot of ugliness down at that school that year. Best we just move on and forget it. But though the rest of the world did forget about Clinton High School, the students and teachers and parents and townspeople affected by the story could not. Their experiences had changed them, scarred them, broken them. Some were able to rebuild their lives, but others were not. Two people I'd come to admire, complicated individuals with the hamartias necessary for classical heroes, never recovered. Both would die by suicide. The first lesson of this book is this. History is the story of human beings. Individuals responding to events already in motion and seldom under their control. Along the way, many of them end up doing things they never expected. Sometimes they act bravely, changing their world for good. At other times, they do injury to people they would have called friends. Very few of us are simply heroes or villains. None of us deserves to be remembered for only the very best or very worst things we have done. And yet we must be accountable for our damage. And a lot of damage was done in those years.
I told you were in for a treat. Both books are nonfiction, obviously, and they read the imagery, the phrasing, the sentence structure is so good in both books. They read almost like novels. And Rachel, I told you, really considering making this a textbook in the for the American government class that I teach, because it's just so good. So same question that I asked Monica. The people of Clinton, Tennessee, you grew up in Nashville. Clinton, Tennessee is further east. How did the people there receive you when you started talking about this?
Well, when I first started doing it, there was a lot of skepticism from all sides, right? No matter who it was. They were in the process of trying to open up a town museum because nothing had ever been made of this story. And so when I first arrived, I had actually been hired by the white leadership of the town to do this work. So that had its own political ramifications. And yeah, I didn't continue working. Quickly ended up, we'll call it independent researcher. But I did find over the years that the process of building that trust and building those relationships meant that very often I would have to spend quite a bit of time getting to know someone, or I would notice an interesting pattern. At the 60-minute mark of an interview, someone would say, "Turn off the tape." Okay, great. And then we would need, especially when I was interviewing one of the Black residents of the town, we would need to have a conversation about who I was and what I was doing. And in the early days, I started this project 18 years ago, we didn't have social media. So they couldn't Google me, they couldn't really find me on Facebook, right? I was pretty unsearchable. And multiple times someone would say, if I had known you were white, I wouldn't have agreed to this interview. First time I panicked, but the second time I said, okay, let's talk about this. Let's have this conversation. And we would talk out who I was, what I was doing. And then they would say, we can restart. And then we get an entirely different account of events the second time around. And with that, I have to say, I know that I have written my version of the Clinton story. I know that there are stories I still do not know. I know that there is another book to be written here. This is what I was trusted with and what I was able to uncover. But yeah, of course, after 18 years, nobody believes you're actually ever going to write the book. So I think the fact that there now is a book has really shocked a few people. But yeah, so far the reception of it has been great, and I'm just waiting.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Monica, would you mind reading the section, please?
I'm also going to start at the beginning. It's the best place to start, and it's about a different Clinton. One day when I was 6, my parents hauled my 2 younger sisters and me around Van Buren County with a realtor, looking for a new house to rent. At the time, we lived in a rundown trailer in Shirley, Arkansas, but my parents wanted to move back to our hometown of Clinton, 10 miles away, and at just over 2,500 people, the biggest town in the area, where my dad wanted to start his own plumbing business. None of the places that we looked at were affordable for us, or if they were not in livable condition. I have a sharp memory of my parents taking us gamely into the attic of a small house, promising it could be our bedroom and that we could climb the stairs every night on our own, only to find part of the roof missing and dead autumn leaves all over the floor. We bounced down unpaved, rutted dirt roads and curvy country highways in our Ford LTD station wagon, up and down the hills, generously called mountains, that form the southern edge of the Ozarks. We trekked through mud and gravel and pine needles. My parents kept the search going all day, even after it was clear nothing we saw would work. Tired and cranky, I finally made it known that I was done. I hate this town and I don't want to move, I said. And I hate all this nature. The realtor, whose cap of permed hair was shaped like a mushroom atop her head, looked back at me and cackled her smoker's laugh. You'll think different someday. That memory comes to mind every time I'm on top of Bee Branch Mountain, which crests just south of Clinton, my hometown. For 20 years as an adult, I lived elsewhere, going to college outside Philadelphia, and then living and working as a journalist in New York City, Stamford, Connecticut, and Washington, D.C. Whenever I came back for a visit, I had to drive over that mountain to get home from the airport in Little Rock. From its summit, I can see Clinton below me. Ahead of me, the mountains stretch north, a mass of green hills that roll all the way up to the middle of Missouri. My drive home had always been long and disorienting. Passing towns full of deprivation made me feel suffocated, as I had as a kid, and I felt pity for the people trapped there. But one day, as I was driving home from the airport, I was older in my 30s, I looked out from the mountaintop, saw Clinton and the sparsely populated landscape beyond, and felt a flutter of homesickness. I've seen many landscapes that were objectively more beautiful, the man-made cityscapes of London and Paris and New York, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the Mediterranean, the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest, but none of those places were where I came from. On Christmas Eve 2015, I was on Bead Branch Mountain again, this time looking for my childhood best friend, Darcy Bonner. Darcy and I had reconnected 8 months earlier when she reached out to me through Facebook. Before that, I had seen her only once since high school, briefly, at my dad's funeral in November 2006. I'd been back in Clinton a number of times since we'd gotten back in touch, and we'd spent a lot of time together, catching up and getting to know each other again. Before flying for Christmas, I had let her know I'd be in Clinton for the holiday, and she had asked me to drive her to Little Rock once I got there. It was a long trip that I didn't want to make right after I got home, but I didn't know when I'd get another chance to see her. I warned Darcy that I would need to get underway early in the morning so I could return to my mother's house by 3 p.m. Mama needed her car for last-minute Christmas errands. I was also eager to have dinner with my family, my mom, my sister, and my partner, Samir, who'd be waiting in the house for me to return. When I set out to pick her up that morning, I followed the directions I'd scribbled in a reporter's notebook. I followed them south on the highway and then up Bead Branch Mountain, across from the flooded old rock quarry where we used to go swimming, where minerals turned the water sapphire blue. I turned out onto a little dirt road. I hoped Google Maps would help me navigate the rest of the way. Darcy was staying with a man named James, but she hadn't seemed entirely sure where he lived, even as she tried to explain it to me. On paper, she kept saying, sounding drunk, "I'm only staying at that address on paper. Do you understand?" I didn't. The road at the top of the mountain, rocky and heavily rutted, looked as though it hadn't been graded in decades. If I'd met another car, I'd have had to pull over into the ditch to let it pass. Knee-high, weedy grass lined the edges of the road, and brown vines covered the barren trees like a wintry jungle. I got no cell reception, and my Google Maps app gave me up for lost. I could only surmise from the mailboxes that someone lived back there. I pushed forward despite my fear of damaging the 2-year-old Buick I'd just helped my mom buy. It wasn't fit for such a road. The first house I saw, James' father's, was a double-wide trailer, blue with knee trim. Behind it was Jim's little single-wide. It was small and weather-beaten, with corrugated metal walls that would not resist a strong wind. And like so many trailers in that area, it had a wooden porch and wood frame exoskeleton, all working together to prop it up. 4 dogs ran up to greet my car, and when they wouldn't move, I parked along the road, far from the house. Getting out, I was thankful I'd worn my boots and old yoga pants, which I didn't mind getting dirty. There was a camper off to the side beneath a garage-sized wooden shed in muddy yard. 2 lawn chairs had been set up around a meat smoker that smelled of chicken. A path of stones led me to the trailer. A man I took to be James opened the door. He was a couple inches taller than my own 5'5", thin and wiry, with the kind of tan, rough, white-skinned white people get after years of outside work, and a mop of dirty blonde hair. He was wearing a Budweiser t-shirt and holding a Budweiser can. "Are you Darcy's friend?" he asked. "She should be ready any minute." He turned and I followed him inside. The trailer was gloomy with dark, fake wood paneled walls and 2 deep windows curtained with dark sheets. It had a kitchen on one end with cabinets of particle board and laminate and a little kitchen island stacked with papers and food and beer. The living room was big enough only for a couch and TV. A Great Dane-sized smut lifted its head in excitement. A man who was older than James with pale skin, dark hair, and a mustache was sitting there, and I introduced myself. "Was Billy Potts your daddy?" he asked. I said yes. He looked at me with eyes that were watery from fear. I knew him. He was a good man. Both he and James were on the counter, or were working on the 48 pack on the counter. Darcy emerged from the only bedroom, holding a mason jar that smelled strongly of apple wine. "Give me a minute. I just need to find my makeup bag." She brushed her fingers through her curly black hair. She had been straightening her hair since we were kids, but now she seemed to be getting the job only half done. She pulled it back into a headband, but pieces kept popping out like unruly twigs. She wore wide, flowing, multicolored, multi-patterned pants and a tank top. Her voice was raspy, her speech punctuated with quick staccato laughs. She always liked to laugh and to make people laugh, and often wore half a smirk, as if she were entertained by the world. Whenever I saw her, it felt like we'd never stopped knowing each other. I followed her into the small bedroom and she sat down on the edge of the bed. She kept turning around, forgetting from one minute to the next what she was doing. Pieces of hair would pop up, she'd smooth them down, then put on makeup, then look for something, over and over again. The dogs tumbled into the bedroom and I patted them while fending off offers of beer from the men. We need to get on the road, I nudged, and we finally made it out of the bedroom. Darcy stuffed her cigarettes and lighter into her purse, set down her mason jar, and went up to James, who was pulling food out of the decrepit fridge. I need some money, she said bluntly. He gave her a 20, and she gave him a his. Darcy and James had met only weeks before. Before staying at his place, I'd later learned she had no income and had been homeless. Was her need for shelter the reason for the relationship? I would ask her later, and she said no. But in the past, when she needed money or places to stay or money or security, she had always relied on relationships with men. This was my first view into how unstable her life had become. I'm sorry if I smell like alcohol, she said shakily from the passenger seat as we buckled up. My throat was hurting so bad. These are some of the best people, she indicated the trailer through the windshield. They'll do anything nice for me, but they're stern. I was distracted backing out of the yard and dodging the dogs, so I didn't ask what she meant by stern. Most of her conversation as we drove away was incoherent rambling that went nowhere except unrelated tendrils of conversation. How do you know James, I asked. That's where it gets crazy, is right there with James, she said. Oh my gosh, Monica, you wouldn't believe the things that go on in these hills. I look around and I'm like, is this really happening?
Just crafting such a great story. I feel like I could see James, feel the waters of the Blue Hole, hear the realtor's smoky voice. I mean, you describe it so well, and that's what makes the book just so readable and good. Now, later on, you wrote in the book, the flip side of American independence is a tendency to abandon people to their fates. That is a beautifully tragic line. Explain it in terms of
Yeah, I think the best example is I saw during the COVID pandemic where everyone thought it was their own job to protect themselves. Like if you want to protect yourself from this virus, then you have to be the one to wear a mask. You can avoid stores. You can, do these things to protect yourself. But it was a communicable disease. It's a virus that you can pass to other people, and maybe we owe it to other people to not pass the virus to them. Maybe we owe it to make a safe community together and to work together, and some of us make a little bit of a sacrifice to make sure that our grandmothers and our grandfathers and our neighbors are okay. And I think that that's something that I see, all the time. There are some things we can only do together. There are some things that only community can work on together to do together. It's not just everyone for himself. That's not society.
Right. Do you think as well that that independence will prevent and pride will prevent people from asking for help?
Sometimes, yes, absolutely. I've seen people ask for help, and people are happy to give it the first time. They need support, but if someone continually needs support, if someone is just in a state of long-term struggle, I start to see people say, well, you got help a month ago. Maybe it's time to figure this out for yourself, without thinking that maybe there's something longer term going on in that person's life.
Okay, one thing that struck me is the role of religion in your town. It's not a new concept, obviously, but folks in a bigger city like Little Rock sometimes don't fully understand the power of the pulpit in a small town. Can you talk about how religion is and was a force in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not just where you go to church and your personal relationship with religion and how you choose to worship. The powerful people in town might all go to the same church and reinforce each other's power, and they vote on each other for positions of political leadership in that town. And so the views of the church become entwined with what the town leaders think should be happening, what the town leaders think should be done. And so those kinds of things magnify and turn into, they kind of take over the civic life of the town. There's not a place outside of the church where you can just gather and be a resident of Clinton and maybe believe different things separately and get along anyway. But instead, the kind of gravitational force around the town are these few big churches where all the town leaders go, the superintendent of the schools might go, and that kind of reinforces the power that one place has over people's lives.
Very good. Rachel, kind of the same question. You wrote at the beginning of your book, you said something along the lines of the white people in Clinton, Tennessee at the time, most of them were churchgoers. They would never say a cuss word. They would never, let loose any type of cuss word, but they would use racial slurs freely. Can you talk about that? That the religion, there was a disconnect between faith and action.
Oh, I don't think there was a disconnect. And I think that is something that particularly the white church needs to deal with. And I feel like I do need to clarify that this is coming, I am a person of faith. This is coming from within the community, not from outside the community. This is something that I have witnessed and lived and worked through and struggled with myself and within my own relationship to what I believe. Both sides of the civil rights movement, particularly in the rural South, were church-based efforts. Now, we are somewhat familiar with what that meant for the Black church. And in Clinton, that was true. The original desegregation lawsuit was brought by 5 parents, one of whom was the local Baptist preacher. So that, before school, every day the Black students would gather at the top of, they lived in a community called Freedman's Hill. They would gather at the top of the hill and they would pray together and ask for protection before walking down through the white mobs. So their faith and their beliefs were closely tied. But that was also true within the white segregationist protester community. The Tennessee white youth opened up every single meeting they had with a prayer. The only adult allowed in the room was the Reverend Alonzo Bullock, so he could pray God's blessing over their work. They believed that they had to fight desegregation because racism was ordained by God. They believed that if they allowed their church, or if they allowed their community to desegregate, they would be failing their God, and they would be introducing sin into the world. And the tendrils of that belief persist today across white churches. I was raised Southern Baptist. I am now Episcopalian. My new church would like to say we're a whole lot better. I would say we're at least fighting. But it is something that is essential. I think that you can go back and read the very earliest origins of American Christianity and see this tradition. Now, there wasn't a law and order side, so there were no white people in Clinton who said openly that desegregation was right at the beginning of it. There were people who said we will not disobey the law. And the law and order side at least said, this is an exact quote from the pastor of the largest white Baptist church in town, it is more important to be a Christian first and a segregationist second than a segregationist first and a Christian second. And that white pastor did end up taking, really wrestling with his racism and with inequality. He ended up literally putting his body on the line to protect the Black students at one point in this story. So he himself begins to work out what this is going to mean for his faith. But I'm afraid that we have constructed a version of God that looks far too much like us.
I told you. It's a good place to be this morning. Now, one part of your book, and you just may have just answered my question. One part of your book that was haunting, and I still think about it. I read your book a couple of weeks ago, and I still find myself thinking about it quite often, is the after effects of this incident on the players, truly the PTSD of the black children and their families, of the white advocates for the black children and their families. But I'm also interested, did you sense any PTSD from the perpetrators? Any guilt? Like, I gotta get this off my chest type thing. So if you'll answer, just in general, the haunting after effects.
Yeah, this did have long-term implications for particularly the students who had gone through this, particularly the black students who had gone through this. And they will talk at this point fairly openly about it. Bobby Kane, who was the first black student to graduate from Clinton High School, said that the first time he really understood who he was after soldiers started coming back from Afghanistan. And we began discussing PTSD. And he said, oh, that's me. And for him, that was sort of it was a light bulb. It gave him something he could work on, something he could do. It was something that could be addressed and healed. And but yes, it had very serious implications for the black students. And the two people who ended up committing suicide are white leaders in the town who ended up taking stands. It broke them. Both of their families and their communities say they never recovered. Clinton High School destroyed them, and their sense of belonging, their sense of place. I wish I could say that I saw something similar on the other side. I do know that there were a few people, most of whom had fallen on the law and order side, who had been students in 56, 57, 58, who have individually apologized to some of the black students. Usually it was, I'm so sorry I did not stand up for you. So kind of that middle ground, perhaps. I also had a number of people where I had read the court transcripts, I had read the newspaper articles, I knew what they had done. And in an interview I would say, can you tell me about this? And then they would say, well, my brother, my cousin did this. They would distance the actions from themselves, and I would like to say that at least means that they feel some level of embarrassment or shame. Whereas there were a few people who just said, yeah, that was me. Okay.
Heroes in this story, definitely the black families who, entrusted their children to this process. The football team, they were deputized in the beginning to be bodyguards of sorts, and that kind of waned after a while, I think. But who are the heroes in this book?
Yeah, I suppose heroes is the right word. I honestly do start to hesitate to use the word like heroes, because again, I think we think of heroes as being something more than we are. Heroes are the people we cannot hope to aspire to be. The reality is, these were ordinary people in a tiny little town who did something radical by going to school and changed American history. And that is what each and every one of us must do exactly where we are. We like to think that we need grand orators, and we do. We need somebody who can give us the big dream and can set the national agenda. But when it comes down to it, what actually changes society is each of us doing what we need to do right where we are. And very often that means something as simple as saying, I'm going to school today and it's going to be different. I'm going to my work today. I'm going to my church today. I'm going to ask the hard questions from a place of love because I do belong here. I'm going to stay because I do belong here. You don't get to take me out. You don't get to take You don't get to abuse the person next to me. I will use my words and my body to protect those who are being attacked. That is an act of heroism, but when we call it that, we make it something that we don't have to do anymore. And so I hesitate to go there. Because in order to fix what's happening in America right now, every single one of us has to start showing up and doing that work right where we are.
It's a great answer. In the Holocaust Museum, there is a sign that reads, "Thou shalt not be a victim, thou shalt not be a perpetrator, but above all else, thou shalt not be a bystander." And that is exactly what you're talking about. I hung it in our school building, just to remind kids that the ones standing around watching the bullies or watching the fight are the ones really at fault.
America has a new silent majority, and it is the most dangerous thing about us at this moment in time.
Good point. Monica. So Rachel's book is obviously about education in many respects, but yours is too. The education that you get, you talk about it thoroughly, and talk about Clinton High and taking the ACT and then heading off to college. Tell us the role that education, plays in this story for you and for Darcy.
Yeah, I think that growing up, I had viewed education as sort of an escape plan, and that I would use it to get out of a place I didn't want to be and get to a place where I wanted to be. I graduated high school and went to Bryn Mawr College, which is outside of Philadelphia, and I just stayed in that part of the country, and it really opened me up to different cultures and different ways of living and different kinds of career opportunities that I don't know if I would have had if I would have stayed. But I think that and the biggest thing for me was that it made me happier. I was happier in that environment. I found my kind of way of being in college. I was able to explore who I was and who I wanted to be. And I think we tend to think of education as like a path to financial prosperity, as a kind of jobs program for people who grow on the lower end of the income scale. And I wish we would think of it more as a way of figuring out who we wanted to be, as a way of learning to be in the world, as a way of thinking about ourselves as complete people and exploring how it is that we want to live and what would make us happy, and less of a where am I going to fit into this capitalist workplace when I get out of it. And I think that's really actually really important, because especially with higher education, it's a political discussion we're having right now. It's what kind of, everybody has to go to college, everybody has to, we all have to do this to make a living, to be middle class. And I think it should be more, what do students at that age need? What do people at that age need to figure out who they are and what they're going to do with their lives, not just with their jobs, not just with their careers. So I think that's something missing in the current education conversation, and something that I was able to find for myself.
Very good. One last question, and then we're going to get to your questions. The role of drug use in a rural town. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, when we were growing up in Erie County, where Clinton was a dry county, and the people I knew who partied told me that it was easier to get meth than it was to get alcohol. And so they would just kind of be hanging out in the woods and partying, and there were all these drugs, and the drugs got more dangerous, and they are continuing to get more dangerous. I think in a small town, what happens though too is that everybody knows everyone. So everyone is touched by a drug epidemic when it strikes. Everyone knows somebody whose life has been affected or turned upside down by a meth addiction. And I think for small towns, that's really, really hard, because it makes it harder to, invent a new life for yourself, to turn it around, to get out of those old habits and get away from people who might be not the best influence on you or who remind you of those old things. So I think that's what's different about a small town. Drugs are obviously everywhere, but I think that is how it affects small town people the most.
Do you see Darcy now, today? How is Darcy doing? I felt like I got to know her.
Yeah. Darcy's, the last time I talked to her, I do talk to Darcy. The last time I talked to her was a little bit earlier in the year. She's doing great. She's been clean since 2019. She's in a treatment program that's worked really well for her. She has a job, and she's been really stable for a few years now.
Great. Okay. If you have a question, you may come to either one of the microphones. I believe is probably the easiest way to do it. Yes, sir.
Thank you both for being here. Our governor and legislature have recently justified a lot of the erasing of history on the basis of indoctrination and fear of indoctrination. I wonder if you could comment on that in both of your communities.
Yeah, I mean, I am a historian. That's obviously something I'm very, very concerned about. When we erase moments of history, when we more specifically erase people from history, it is a way that we determine who does and does not fit in our society and in our nation moving forward. It is erasing their very presence and their humanity. In many ways, it's a continuation of the idea that certain people are only, 3/5. That their stories and their history and their past, their contributions, their struggles, don't count as much as someone else's. It is an obvious way of reinforcing our current inequality and power structure along race, class, gender, and sexual lines. I mean, it's just being done blatantly at this point. But the long-term ramifications of that are extreme. The other thing that really concerns me about it, now obviously, I think that there are things that 6-year-olds are not yet prepared to deal with. Yes. But in an attempt to protect certain 6-year-olds, or even more certain 13, 14, 15-year-olds, from specific knowledge we don't want them to have, we're not acknowledging the fact that there are other 6-year-olds or 13, 14, 15-year-olds who are having to live daily with the implications of what we have done to their societies. So it's lovely to say that you don't think certain 6-year-olds should know about violence. But there are entire communities of children that have to deal with violence on a daily basis. And the decision to artificially protect some kids from that knowledge means you're leaving other children vulnerable, which then really, really exposes who counts and who doesn't in our world today. So book ban terrifies me.
Yeah, I agree with everything she just said, and also as Arkansas in particular as a state has never really reckoned with its history. And I think when I was in school, I learned about the Little Rock Nine, the desegregation of Little Rock Central on the Disney Channel, or the Disney Channel movie. And I learned about the Elaine Massacre when I was an adult at the 100-year anniversary. And, I think these things have a way of bubbling up. You can't suppress history. But at the same time, I would say that there's this overt effort to lie about our history, to keep the true history from being taught in schools. But there's also sort of a more subtle effort, too, that you see with, kind of discouraging students from studying history in college and English. Those careers aren't useful. But those careers are incredibly useful if we care about being a whole society where people know about our own past and know what it means for our future and study political movements. Those things are also invaluable to a democracy. And it's not just about how much money they're going to make when they graduate. So I think you kind of see discounting of history in all kinds of ways now.
Jackson, Mississippi. But I really identified with a lot of the points that were made about small towns. And one of the things I thought, Monica, that you did especially well, which goes beyond what you already said about religion, is how the evangelical culture permeates everything. And I certainly experienced that growing up. But in particular, how that culture affects women and what girls are expected, what's expected of girls, and this whole notion in your book about how if you get pregnant and become a mother, all of a sudden there's a different way people look at you. So I wondered if you could say some more about this evangelical culture and its effect on women.
Yeah, it's always a supportive role, that your role is to support the men in your life, to obey your husband, even when that's not overt, it kind of trickles down and you get that idea. It was something I hoped had changed, and I interviewed 2019 grads, and the things that they said to me were still, this kind of idea that there is a women's job market, and it's different from what's available to men, that they would have to go to college for 4 years just to achieve parity, just to get a job that paid well, required more work from them, more effort on their part. They had to excel. This idea was sort of, I have to go to college and get a good job because what happens if something happens to the man in my life? I'm not going to be able to support myself. So there still is that sort of expectation that the head of the family, the primary breadwinner, and the kind of spiritual head of the family, the person who is going to set your agenda, is your husband. That being a wife and being a mother is first and foremost. And those are fantastic things. I'm neither personally, but I just didn't ever want to get married. But those things are wonderful things to be, but we don't have the same message for boys, that being a husband, being a father is also something that they should strive to be. And, why is that and what does that mean? And so it's something I still see.
Very good. And if you look at 538.com, Monica's latest article, GOP primary voters are whiter, older, and more evangelical than Americans overall. So I've got a copy if you'd like to do that. Listen, thank you both for doing this. Such an honor for me to be able to visit with you. You two are invited to go to the book signing table. And folks, you are invited to get your book signed. And I know Wordsworth is outside selling them. And then you have the opportunity to also rate this panel and cast a vote. So I'm going to excuse you two. This way is what my instructions are, so if you don't mind. And I'll talk to you for just a brief moment while they exit.